Chapter 3 will cover Pavlovian, or as we commonly refer to it, classical conditioning. Video 1, we will start with a practice kind of thought activity to get you started thinking about classical conditioning before going over the elements of classical conditioning, which you're likely familiar with. Video 1 for many of you will be a review, but I want you to pay special attention to the elements as we go through them and make sure you have a firm understanding of what each of them means. We'll then look at some higher order conditioning and other aspects of classical conditioning that you might not be familiar with before talking about extinction and theories about why exactly conditioning happens in video 3. So to get started, I want you to think about a behavior that a friend of yours, a significant other, a child, or maybe even a behavior you yourself has that you wish they would stop. I want you to start thinking about this because that is going to be the basis of your behavioral modification paper that you're going to conduct and write up later in the semester. Start thinking about it now as I go through this lecture so that you can begin making connections between that assignment and our content. So pause this video for a second, go ahead and write down that behavior and maybe try to design an intervention to get them or yourself to stop that behavior. So the question I'm asking you here is, how would you go about getting a person to stop a behavior that you wish they would stop? Once you've had a second to think about that and write it down, continue playing the video. To get started looking at the foundation of classical conditioning, we of course need to begin by talking about Ivan Pavlov. He was the Russian physiologist, not psychologist, who first kind of discovered in a scientific manner classical conditioning. Like I said, he was a physiologist who actually studied the circulatory system and the digestive system, which is how he came across this discovery. He had actually developed a surgical procedure that he was using to study the digestive process of a dog. It looked something like this, where he actually had inserted a mechanism into the dog's cheek that measured salivation. Because the dogs in his lab had this kind of contraption, this mechanism in their mouth to measure their salivation, he was able to eventually discover things that prompted salivation to begin that weren't directly eating food. So, as he began doing his separate research project, he discovered that the reflective action of those glands beginning to salivate actually depended on stimuli. We know that reflexes, as we talked about in the last week's content, depend on stimuli. But that stimuli doesn't necessarily have to be something that naturally or unlearned causes that reflex. So, in Pavlov's dog situation, the dog actually began to salivate before taking food into its mouth. That was the first thing he discovered. The digestive process actually begins before food enters the mouth, meaning that something is prompting that reflex other than food itself, other than the taste or smell of food. After a while, he realized that that salivation process occurred as soon as the dog entered the lab. So before even seeing food, the salivation would begin. He made these observations and began to wonder, can I make the dog salivate at the sight or sound of random objects? And that's how we got classical conditioning. So, you're likely familiar with this kind of setup where Pavlov had a dog in the lab and he tried to teach the dog to basically associate different objects with food to see if it would prompt this digestive process. And that word associate is very important. Operant and classical conditioning are heavily based off of forming learning associations. So, the elements of classical conditioning, how we form these associations, how we learn to associate something with something that otherwise we would not associate it with. Once again, this is likely very familiar to you, but I am going to walk you through it. Before conditioning, or you can think of this as before learning, happens, we have an unconditioned stimulus, or something that naturally prompts us to engage a reflex, or the unconditioned response. And the condition, or the example of Pavlov's dog, food, is the unconditioned stimulus, and it causes salivation, which is the unconditioned response. No learning had to occur for this to happen, because we innately or naturally, without having to be taught, salivate when we taste food. Also, before any learning occurred, the sound of a whistle, or in the real case of Pavlov's dog, it was a metronome. I just really like this diagram, so we're going to call it a whistle for a second. The sound of a whistle doesn't cause a response. We don't really have a reflective response to hearing a whistle. So the whistle is called the neutral stimulus. It's neutral. It means nothing before conditioning or learning has occurred. However, the process of conditioning consistently or continuously pairs that neutral stimulus with that unconditioned stimulus, meaning that they occur around the same time, and the dog learns to associate them together. They associate, or it associates one with the other. So during conditioning, Pavlov continuously paired the food with the whistle, or the metronome. After many trials of that, the whistle now elicits that same reflexive response. It's now a conditioned stimulus, because we have been conditioned or learned that the whistle means food, and it causes the same response, the conditioned response, as that unconditioned stimulus did and still does. So the basic elements here that you need to know: the neutral stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. Take a second, pause the video, and think through that, and make sure you understand those variables. Helpful hint: the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are always the same thing. The conditioned stimulus is just after learning has occurred. So, if asked to label those, know that they're the same thing. The conditioned response and the unconditioned response are the same thing. With the conditioned response, it's just happening in response to the conditioned stimulus. So as I mentioned, you can think about these behaviors as reflexes. The variables, or the elements of classical conditioning, actually involve two distinct types of reflexes: unconditioned and conditioned. The unconditional reflex is that unconditioned response. The inborn, permanent, we are born doing this thing, natural, innate behavior that all members of a species have. That reflex, or that behavior, occurs without learning having occurred. We salivate when we taste food. It's an unconditional reflex. However, we can also learn to have that reflex in response to something else, and that's the conditional reflex. It's learned from the environment, in Pavlov's dog case, from the lab. It varies between individuals because not all dogs have that experience. We have not all been conditioned by the same environment, and so we have different conditioned responses. And the conditional reflex, or response, depends on the condition and the situation. They are both still reflexes. We'll talk more about how reflexes kind of play into this when we talk about theories of development in video 3. We also have the unconditional reflexes. The unconditional stimulus, just to summarize, we have the unconditioned reflex, which causes the unconditional response. Okay? So that unconditioned reflex is the process between the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. If you think back to the lecture where we talked about reflexes, remember a reflex isn't just a behavior, but rather a relationship between a stimuli and a behavior. In this situation, that unconditional reflex is the relationship between the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. The conditional reflex refers to the relationship between the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. So you might be wondering how exactly a neutral stimulus comes to be a conditioned stimulus. How does that happen? What are kind of the requirements for something to become a conditioned stimulus? And what I want to point out here is that any stimuli or stimulus could become a conditioned stimulus if and only if it regularly precedes an unconditional stimulus. So really the only requirement we have for, what and how something can become a neutral stimulus is that it's paired with that unconditioned stimulus. In the case of Pavlov, it was a metronome. It could have been a light. It could have been a smell of something else. It could have been a picture of a person's face. Any stimuli can become a conditioned stimuli as long as it is regularly preceded by the unconditioned stimuli or that thing that naturally elicits that reflex. A couple of important notes. The conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are, during the conditioning process, presented regardless of what an animal or person, whatever it is, whoever it is that is becoming conditioned, does. This is very important and is in fact a key difference between classical and operant conditioning. The behavior of the animal doesn't matter. They can be spinning around in circles, barking, they can be sitting up and sitting down and rolling over. No matter what their behavior is, the environment behaves in this way, where the conditioned stimulus or neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are presented. When behavior becomes involved, when that dog or whoever it is being conditioning has to elicit a specific behavior for something to happen, that's operant conditioning, which we will get into later. An example here, the dog did not have to salivate or do anything else to get the food. Those occurrences, that pairing, happened regardless of its behavior. That's it for video 1. Video 2 will begin by looking at higher order conditioning.